Go ahead, Randy. So I think we've adequately discussed this to the degree that we need to. You had a plan for the panel. Why don't we begin?
I think we want to open the table for folks who are on the panel to make any observations they'd like to about Chapter 5 or any recommendations they think that are appropriate to improve the policy, the plan, before we wrap this discussion up.
All right. I'll accept that direction. Let's begin with Mr. Zuckerman and proceed down the line to discuss any items of interest in Chapter 5.
I think you need to understand that you're stepping into a complicated area.
The first one.
Master of understatement.
And if you look at the complications that come out of these things and try to compare them to the larger issues that you're dealing with in terms of flood control, water supply, ecosystem restoration, you run the risk of spending 90% of your time in the future on issues like the Clarksburg type issue. I mean,
the old mill.
Yeah. The Delta Protection Commission, I think, was set up to handle most of these disputes. I think you ought to try to fence it off so that not too many of these things come up to the commission on a consistency thing, and try to be fairly clear. And to the extent that you do anticipate exercising consistency jurisdiction over these things, it's incumbent upon you to have really clear language, which this last discussion has sort of pointed out it doesn't exist yet in this, so that you'll be in a position to rule fairly and quickly with a minimum of confusion. Because when you start getting down to these local issues, there are lots of people involved. There's lots of emotion. There's lots of energy involved in it. And make sure that your key core issues here don't get lost somewhere in this morass.
Okay, Mr. Rentz. I'll defer to Mr. Machado.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, the Commission would like to acknowledge the incorporation of much of the material in Chapter 5 for the economic sustainability side. There's probably 5 points that I'd like to make. First of all, I raised the issue earlier about legacy communities. I think it's a term that's becoming overused, and I think people are ascribing more to it than what really it is, and I would hope that the Council might think of more clarifying the definition so people's expectations may be tempered from what they are now. And in part, I think it's...
Does the Commission have some language that they would want us to consider? Or just...
I think in many part they would just say no legacy communities and just talk about communities in the Delta that were within the primary zone. I think it's a term of art from the legislature that it has a meaning in terms of that, in terms of the historical perspective of the Delta. But beyond that, it doesn't. And people have taken it to mean that there is more benefits to being labeled that will accrue to them than what really is there.
What you're flagging is everybody who wants government programs will want to declare themselves a legacy town so they can get it.
You've probably stated it very well.
Yeah.
Mike, say again the definition that you just offered. A community in the primary zone? That was...
that's a very simple way of looking at it because you are dealing with just communities. Do they have a historical perspective? Yes, in terms of development of the Delta. Do they have a different perspective going forward? Absolutely. And I think that reflects, too, on the tone of Chapter 5. As an evolving place, it says that you're not going to create a fortress, preserve, or a museum. But the fact of the matter is, there's been little change along 160 in the last 20 years. The population of the primary zone has remained static. And one would expect that there's not going to be a lot of change in the next 20 years with what the view of the Delta is today. And we talk about implementing economic development. That'd be my third point. The third being no growth. We talk about doing economic development, and part of the charge for the Delta Protection Commission with the completion of the ESP was to talk about implementing economic development. Well, the plan recognizes that agriculture is the primary economic activity of the Delta. And that activity has essentially remained unchanged over the course of development of the Delta. It has adapted to changing markets, and we've seen that within the commodity mix of agricultural products that are being produced. But essentially, the economy of the Delta has been that of agriculture. And so the tone, and if you take a look at the first part of Chapter 5, it talks about recreation and tourism as being flat. But yet, at the end of the chapter, it talks about growth in tourism and recreation, and particularly ag tourism, and also an implication that ag tourism may have a value that can offset any direct losses to agriculture in general. I think that's a false tone, because I think essentially the Delta remains much as it is today 20 years from now. And then the ESP, in fact, looked at what would happen to tourism, whether it be landside, waterside, ag tourism, what would happen to recreation. And there would be a 5%, probably 50% growth, but it would take 20 to 35 years for that to even happen. And that goes to why. Well, you have a regulatory framework from a myriad of agencies that creates a maze that most private investors find it difficult and are unwilling to try to navigate. And when you ask a private investor, what would it take to invest in the Delta? And most of them will come back and say, we need as a minimum a 25% greater rate of return than what would be experienced in a normal investment project without the layers of regulations. And so I think I don't think that's fully recognized in the chapter of the challenges. And that leads, I think, to some of the conflicts within the Delta Plan, the co-equal goals, and the objective inherent that the co-equal goals that the legislature expounded on. And I've mentioned it before. It does enhance, preserve agriculture, recreation, tourism,
Mike,
as they evolve in place.
In the section on productive farmland, the narrative in the Delta Plan now points out that there's been a drop from almost 550,000 acres of ag land in the entire statutory delta down to 460,000 in 2008, and the percent of agricultural lands decreased from 65% of the combined acreage to 55%. So it's possible to take the primary zone and get a different picture, but for the entire delta, we are losing farmland. Within the spheres of influence of cities, we know that 28,000 acres or so will be converted to urban development. So don't we also, we're facing a problem of ag land loss that's being converted to urban development largely on the fringes, I can see.
I agree. And I have no argument there. I'm talking about the substantive economy of the Delta. It's going to remain agriculture. And that if there is going to be any reduction of agricultural lands in the primary zone, the implication that recreation and tourism could make up for that loss, I think is very, very optimistic and not realistic. Because I think basically the primary zone, with all of the border boundaries around it now, and all of the other conditions that are in place that have to be met to do anything, the primary zone essentially remains unchanged going forward. And agriculture will stay where it's at. It will adapt to market conditions. And my point would be is that even though we are not looking at preserving it or making a museum or a fortress, in a large part, the Delta primary zone, in essence, is going to remain unchanged.
Patrick, did you have a question at this point? Oh, okay, sorry.
The other part of I think is that if you look at Chapter 5, you can also look at it appears to be in isolation. Because the one thing that makes the primary zone economy work is a robust levee system. So without linkage directly with levees and a levee system that protects the primary zone, the economy of the Delta doesn't flourish and becomes in jeopardy. And I don't think there's a clear linkage as to the economy's dependence upon the levee system. And I'm not talking about standards at this point. I'll leave that to 7. But I think that is an issue that's not drawn here. Without the levee system, there's no agriculture. Without the levee system, there's no communities. Without the levee system, there's no highways. Without the levee system, there's no infrastructure protection for natural gas, aqueducts, pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. And that's an integral part of that. And that's what I find that seems to be more common as we go through the Delta plan, is each chapter is a silo. And we don't have this overall linkage that puts them together. And I think in doing so, it may very well impact the policy conclusions that are made at the end of each chapter.
Well, Mr. Machado, if the legislation that created us and set up our duties had said that the single most important purpose for the entire state of California is to protect the current status quo economy of the Delta, I think your argument would be compelling. But it declared the co-equal goals of water reliability for all of California and improvement in the Delta ecosystem as the two primaries to be done in a way that respects the condition of the Delta, which is under change, to be sure. And I understand the argument that is made here and made in the Chapter 7 and the economic sustainability plan is, from the local perspective, preserving the levees is the kind of driver of the issue.
I think you misinterpreted me. There's a linkage to the levees. I specifically said I wasn't talking about standards. But I think there has to be an acknowledgement of the dependence of the Delta economy on the levee system. Now, it doesn't mean we can't reinterpret the levee system and there's an adaptation to it by those there in order to be able to meet the legislative mandate. I haven't said that yet. But what I'm saying is I don't think there is a common thread that links the chapters together so that they're synergistic.
And you believe the levee policy is that common thread?
I think levee policy is, because it affects habitat.
Well, I think it's important, but I wouldn't say that's the prism through which all the interests of the state of California are properly viewed.
But in fact, you have viewed it in that respect in terms of fiscal responsibility and potential liability.
If I could, just maybe just deal with this issue. We had tried in page 179 of Chapter 5, in lines beginning with line 18, to acknowledge the important role of a variety of kinds of infrastructure, including levees, as contributors to the Delta's economy. It's the levee system, the roads, the other transportation elements, the ports, all make important contributions to the Delta economy, and it would be not that difficult to revise the text, probably beginning with the text that's in line 25 that talks about the Delta's levees, because we certainly weren't, our intention was to indicate that they did play an important role in the Delta's economy, and I can understand the sense that perhaps a single sentence acknowledging that is inadequate. I was trying to save keystrokes, and maybe I should add a paragraph.
I mean, that could be helpful, but I think what was missed in the legislation was a realism, recognition of the reality of what is the Delta. And I would submit, of the 120 that had the opportunity to vote on it, fewer than 10% understand or been to the Delta to see what it's all about. And I think we have an opportunity in this Delta plan to highlight the challenges that you're facing with the co-equal goals with respect to trying to achieve the co-equal goals and the objective that was recognized as being inherent in the legislation, and also looking at trying to sustain that economy. And I don't think we've done an adequate job of identifying that challenge. That doesn't mean, and I'm not prescribing how it should be addressed. I think we ought to be to identify it, and I think it helps put other things in perspective, and we can make decisions. We make decisions, and we do that with that knowledge. Some may not like, some may not like, but at least we have a recognition of what the delta is and what it depends upon in order to be able to make the $5.5 billion contribution to the state economy that the ESP brought out.
Okay.
Can
Felicia,
an observation which may or may not be very helpful.
press the button.
I did. It's
Okay.
not close enough. Because I don't have edits on it. The place where I definitely agree is that I'm not sure we've laid out some of the key issues, and this may go to my comments on the executive summary and the early introduction, and I wasn't here for last week, so I haven't been writing, but we haven't talked about it as much. Where I don't think at the outset we have laid out some of the key dramatic principles. You've heard me talk a lot about the fact that we don't explain the plumbing. Here, we don't explain the plumbing until some of the issues in the ecosystem chapter. That should be right up front with maps and charts and reverse flows and basomatic at the bottom and all of that from a fish perspective. But we need to also have it in terms of this central fact about the delta, for better or for worse, and the implications it has for both economic sustainability and how we're going to deal with it. It just seems like some of the sort of the bright line issues you would automatically start with at a Rotary Club talk where you only had 20 minutes to talk to an educated, interested group of people. We don't have yet in this. We have a lot of stuff, and it's much better document. Again, when you see my notes on the pages, I say nice, great, good, all the way through it. And there's a lot that I really like, but there are certain key issues. And what Mike's bringing out is one. The issue of the plumbing is one that we still haven't gotten to at the right time and right place to be able to tee up why bother. So I just put it in that category. I think this is worth thinking about. I don't have a answer to it exactly or edits, but I think it's a fair point.
Well, we can keep working on that. Of course, our goal with today's work is to emphasize the policies and recommendations so we can get those things done, Just a couple observations. We do have two full chapters on the 2 full pages on the Delta's economy. The largest piece of that text is about agriculture. In fact, if you look at the Delta as a whole, transportation, warehousing, utilities are the most important sector. Agriculture is the dominant sector in the primary zone, but not in the Delta as a whole. And agriculture wouldn't be listed in the top 5 employment sectors in the Delta as a whole if you looked at total employment and economic contribution. In fact, most people who live in the primary zone actually work in the secondary zone. They're driving to jobs in town. And so it's got a very diverse economy, and I don't mean to downplay the role of agriculture, but I think it's important we see the entire thing. We have not suggested that growth in tourism can compensate for extreme losses of agricultural land. But on the other hand, the economic sustainability plan says that the growth in tourism probably can accommodate for losses of 5, 10, perhaps a little bit more 1,000 acres of agricultural land ecosystem restoration. So we understand there's a trade-off there. I don't know that we can. Our point is that we can't anticipate, because some of this is going to be driven by the DDCP, how big those losses are going to be. What we have tried to do, and this gets to the final point of Mr. Machado's recommendation, is to make sure that we don't impose new regulations on visitor-serving commercial uses and other tourism uses and other reinvestments in the legacy communities. That's why we have such sparse policies. If there's confusion about the regulatory processes that apply there, it's local governments who are the regulators ought to be looking at that, because there's nothing in our policies that would control land use within those legacy communities that would discourage commercial recreational visitor-serving uses. We've avoided that very carefully and the primary responsibility will remain with the local governments. There's issues that need to be dealt with. That's the place to start.
Randy? Yeah, but it'll take 10 minutes to get through Mike and Tom, who want to respond to what Dan just said. You had a question on this point.
Well, Mike, this is the first time I can recall when somebody has come before us and talked straight about the future of the Delta in terms of economic development potential. And I think it's recognized by a lot of people that given the geography, the structure, the setting, that there's not a lot that can change without a huge investment, and that's not on the horizon. So I appreciate that. And given your history, your stature, your current position, it carries a lot of weight, what you just told us. The second thing is the idea that levies are interwoven through every chapter is correct. And the fact that each chapter exists as kind of silos is also correct. I think that where we've missed the boat is in the finance chapter. And I'm looking forward to the discussion with the panel this afternoon because I think that's where you bring it all together. In the water supply side, you talk about what is the statewide interest in levees in the Delta. In Chapter 4, you talk about what's the impact that levees have had on the environment and what changes need to occur and what investments need to occur. In Chapter 5, we talk about what purpose do the levees serve in protecting the history and the ongoing future of the Delta and risk. And every chapter has an element of levees that's going to require an investment and a strategy. And so I think that the missing link that you've clearly identified, I think can be rectified not by redoing the whole plan, but by addressing it in the finance chapter. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's one approach, and I think then in the finance side you have to be very realistic too. And I think this is probably one of the biggest challenge in trying to implement any type of legislation. There's a certain amount of idealism and expectations that not necessarily reflect the reality of the situation. And so if the finance plan is realistic, and I think it does two things. It helps put proposals in perspective, but it also could help set the stage for further discussion of adaptation to be able to meet the collective objectives. And I would look forward to see if it does indeed become the thread there.
Tom?
What I wanted to say in response to Dan's comments is, I live in Stockton, in that vicinity. My family's been there for 100 years. And occasionally we try to identify a major business in the area that isn't dependent upon agriculture. We can't do it. Artificially drawing lines between farming and industry or something else just doesn't work in these communities. The whole area is dependent upon the basic production of agricultural commodities. The whole area. And if you eliminate that or damage it, you're going to see a devastation of the economy of the area. The other thing I wanted to point out is so much of what you're doing here is based upon trying to protect agricultural economies in other parts of the state. This is a major factor in agricultural production, particularly in the kinds of things that do generate value-added products. You're going through the process, through the dairies, through the wineries, through the tomato canneries, and so forth. And so don't lose sight of the fact that this is an important factor of this overall agricultural economy that dominates the Central Valley. And it shouldn't be treated more or less favorably, I suppose, than the rest of it.
Pat?
Mike, have you satisfied yourself that Chapter 5 would convey to a general reader what the Delta Protection Commission is or does, or the primary zone? I ask it because I can only find DPC. It's not even spelled out in the chapter. I think you got to go back a long way, maybe to page 18 of the whole report to even cite it. And it's understandable why, the focus, since it's about water, would be true, but the responsibilities of the Delta Protection Commission and the significance of the primary zone, and as you very clearly pointed out, how its future and its economy is different and is going to be different from the surrounding areas, which are referred to elsewhere, to be sure. But, without delaying it or anything, if you had a suggestion on a paragraph or two of text that would help describe that, because it seems to, you get referred to because of the reports you did as opposed to the responsibilities you have.
And maybe the thing to do would be to look at page 176, beginning in line 27, where in part of a description of how the land use planning is done in the Delta, we highlight the role of the Delta Protection Commission and its land use and resource management plan, how it guides land use.
Randy also pointed out there's a discussion in page 168 under creating a common vision that also mentions it.
Pat, I think you make a good point.
Right. So I think there are a lot of pieces there, but I guess I'm kind of looking for a guiding paragraph. That, otherwise, if you didn't know, how would people? I think are easily confuse the Delta Protection Commission from the Delta Stewardship Council or the Delta Conservancy. So
we're confused with a lot of things,
but.
Fair point. I think we can look at a paragraph.
and I'd be happy to work with staff to try to do that.
Okay. Adding to the council checklist, Mr. Grindstaff and Mr. Machado are going to be looking at some textual language that explains more clearly in the appropriate way the Delta Protections Commission role in this land use and now other planning responsibilities as well. Okay, Don?
I'd also like to reemphasize it.
Get the mic closer to you, please.
If we're going to add something, I think we ought to at least make the linkage about what we have in the primary zone is a function of the levees, and that it's a very important part. And if we don't draw that linkage, it doesn't relate then to 7.
Mr. Chair.
Don.
Mr. Chair, I think Mike said it several times a day here, and I think it is important because you look at all aspects. It's not just holding water back or allowing water to move to its natural destination or moving it elsewhere. All the uses, whether they're on top of the levee, on the water side of the levee, or on the back side of the levee, the lands are protected behind it, and all of the uses that are called out, certainly in different aspects of this chapter and elsewhere. I do think that that's really important. Again, it doesn't provide a solution necessarily, but I think it emphasizes appropriately, at least I believe in the view of the Commission, but certainly in my view as well, how important. Now, how they're dealt with, I think to Mike's point and in the discussion we have in Chapter 7 and elsewhere in the plan, how you deal with responsibility for maintaining, how you deal with responsibility for doing repairs if in the event there is an event of some sort, how you deal with long-term improvements. Those are questions I think that, as Randy said, certainly can be dealt with in Chapter 8 and maybe elsewhere in this plan as well. But I think that if that isn't given some overarching emphasis and linkage to other aspects of the plan, then you really do, from the perspective, I think, of the long-range, not only prosperity and the ability for those communities to thrive, but I think from the standpoint of the co-equal goals, that it diminishes the ability to I think, long-term meet them. And so I guess I would put some emphasis there. And I don't know how we would weave this more into the plan, but I do think that linkage needs to be stressed in the chapters, because without the levees, the Delta would be a very different place. Some people might advocate for that. I don't think most would. And going forward, however we deal with that in all the various forms is going to be critical to, I think, meeting the co-equal goals, but also to the long-term, again, ability for Delta communities, but along with this state of California, to see the Delta be the really special place that it is. So I don't know, again, I don't have a suggestion here today as to how we do that. I think Dan, certainly, and staff have worked to try to bring some focus, but I think it needs to be much clearer and much more linked.
Okay, let's, Ms. Kohler, you were not here yesterday. Ms. Kohler, for those of you who do not know, is leaving the Environmental Defense Fund, where she has been a number of years. She's moving over to a new job with an organization that is public policy oriented, with a water specialty, and based on forums, discussions, issue papers, and other non-political advocacy kinds of stuff. And so this is kind of her last appearance before us as an EDF aficionado. So, Ms. Kohler, thank you for coming.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Am I on here?
Let's see. Try that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I am sorry I was not able to be here yesterday due to other commitments. Most of my comments and our EDF's input into this process really have to do with the subjects you covered yesterday. So if there's an opportunity for that, I'm happy to provide those to you. I've provided written comments and can certainly provide more. On the subject that immediately at hand, the Delta's place and the levees, I will say that's not an area that has been EDF's primary bailiwick. So I will say that we very much support the council's focus on that, but we don't have specific input on those issues to provide for you today.
Okay. Mr. Wilcox, you want to weigh in on this one?
No, thank you.
He's
going to be the Sphinx.
Where
like
angels fear to tread.
Of
Mr.
course,
Slotnick.
no doubt. A few comments. Specifically, since to get to the performance measures, similar to an issue we had yesterday, on page 199.
199.
Performance measure vision here.
Yep.
The second bullet.
Water management ecosystem?
It says including adequate mitigation to avoid adverse effects, and we suggest that you say avoid or minimize. Once again, there's not going to necessarily be an absolute ability to avoid, and so just suggest that change on that. Won't delve too deeply into the Bethel Island discussion. We appreciate the discussion that took place.
We'll schedule an hour for you to come back at the next meeting to do that.
No. You guys did a great job of it. I thought we were wondering why it was a legacy community. Suggest after the conversation you had that maybe you come up with a different term, perhaps, because I think Mike is absolutely right, and whether it's intended or not, that's become sort of a term of art within the development of this plan. And there is an expectation, I think, of the plan that it means something to call a community a legacy community. And in fact, I'm looking for the page. I think it's 168, 160, here it is, 172, for example, at line 25, where you're talking about the legacy communities and that they, quote, resonate with history and culture. Well, I don't know if Bethel does in the way the others did. And then similarly, the conversation, and I agree with Mike that levees are central to what the Delta is as a place. There's no question about that. But those linkages then, as Randy alluded to and Don talked about, sort of implicate what's financially sustainable based on the benefits and beneficiaries of those levies, which we haven't talked about yet as part of the financing. And then, of course, that leads to your focusing instead of on the broad primary zone in total That was why I think the legacy community got started, because those are the unique cultural aspects of the Delta you want to try to protect that are a little more sort of core areas rather than just sort of spread all over. So, I mean, there was a logic to it, and it's referenced in the document a number of times about why you have the term as part of the sort of trying to preserve the unique cultural aspects of the Delta and historic. So, and then finally, or two other comments. One is on page 184. There's a whole paragraph on agriculture and water quality, and we certainly understand that that's important in the Delta, but because you have a chapter on water quality following, we're just not sure what this paragraph adds to the document other than repeating that the ESP has scenarios for potential declines in quality that could accompany activities related to BDCP, basically, when in fact it's the state board that's going to decide what the water quality is going to be or not, regardless. So we frankly we have in our comments suggested alternative language, but we'll just take that out, that paragraph.
Okay.
And then finally, I'll comment, since Mr. Zuckerman mentioned fencing off the Delta Protection Commission activities. I agree with Mr. Johnson. It'd be good to have some discussion of what the role of the commission is, and they've done a lot of good work, no question. But I think it needs to be clear in the document. Right now, it's not totally clear that the land use resource management plan, which they've done, which generally is very good, and the economic sustainability plan, which they've submitted, which also generally has lots of good material in it, you've heard of this before, that those need to be consistent with the Delta plan and not the other way around. And it just needs to be clear, we believe.
I think the commission would take exception to that last statement, because nowhere was in the legislation did it say that the ESP had to be dedicated to supporting state policy, but to provide an objective analysis of what is out there in the Delta. And I also think the paragraph with respect to agriculture and water quality is one of the few times you do provide the linkage between what is happening and what agriculture depends upon, and agriculture in a large part depends on water quality. If not, you wouldn't have some of the standards that are being failed to be met in the South Delta today.
And just if I may, Mr. Chairman, because I agree with what Mike just said. The issue is not that the statute and the economic sustainability plan couldn't do more than you guys talk about. It's just whatever is going to be done has to be consistent with the Delta plan, which is a different issue. And I agree with Mike's characterization about water quality, and I'll just read the suggested language we had, which is the potential for a sustainable agricultural economy in the Delta will depend in part on access to water of sufficient quality and other policy initiatives related to agricultural infrastructure, services, and land management. So we don't disagree, Mike.
Why don't we reserve that deeply meaningful, contentious discussion of how to write what everyone agrees is important to Mr. Grindstaff to resolve in some fashion? Okay. Mr. Bardini's the second day's appearance from the Department of Water Resources. He was seen in a secret meeting at Temple Coffee Shop 2 days ago with high-level flood officials, no doubt preparing for his presentation today.
And with that lead-in, we don't have any comments. I think you've vetted the issue.
Pardon?
I think we vetted the issue pretty well.
Yeah, because we did get the latest letter from the department 2 days ago. 2 days ago, the 13th, I think it was, and there are some detailed comments in there. Okay. All right, questions? Mr. Nordhoff.
Just one comment on page 167, the first page, line 11. We start out describing the Delta's geography being filled with low-lying islands. That's a little bit like saying Charles Manson misbehaved. I think we're missing the point on this one. I think if we're going to call it low-lying, call it below-lying. I think we ought to put in that certainly in the primary zone, they're all below water, sometimes more than 15 feet. And that goes into the levee issue that I think does permeate most of what we're trying to do here. So if you will, Mr. Grinstead, have another go at that.
One more.
Okay, other questions? Randy? Felicia?
Just a couple of observations. I like the chart on 189. That's the kind of thing I'd love to see replicated everywhere possible. Oh, yeah, chart on 189 is really good, and, a good display. I'd like to see more of those. And the other thing, and I say there's a risk of having to go back through the earlier parts of the chapter because I missed something yesterday. It just feels also that in as much as really describing the levees as the heart is a really important piece of this, including Mr. Nordhoff's comments, we should be talking more about climate change than one little paragraph here, because its implications, if we take the 50 to 100-year view for the Delta, is so big that I fear we haven't quite made that point adequately in terms of stuff that it just is hanging there. I don't have an idea on how to do that, but it sort of feels like something we're just passing over a little too quickly in the chapter when it really strikes at the heart of the future in the Delta.
Yeah, I suspect when we get to Chapter 7 on a more focused discussion on risk, we'll rapidly fall into the question of who pays how much for what, because our scientists have generally told us that a bowl in the middle of a geography remains threatened by flooding, and you can spend all the money in the world. You do not resolve or remove risk. You might reduce it, but you do not remove it. And it's understandable that people would want to have risk removed, and it's equally understandable they'd prefer to cost share with somebody else. But the question that we will be resolving when we make our recommendations by 2015 on a state financial policy is what should be the state policy in terms of paying for protection. And we'll get into that discussion in Chapter 7. But Felicia, I'm with you. I think it's important, but the implications go beyond just wishes and wants. They also go to financial ability and who pays.